Police in Nassau County announced that DNA evidence has linked them to the man behind the 1974 murder of Barbara Waldman.
I have had the image of my mom in my head since I was 5, and it will not go away until I die. Those are the words of Eric Waldman, spoken more than 5 decades after a Friday morning in Oceanside, New York, that no one in his family ever fully recovered from. Oceanside sat on the south shore of Long Island, the kind of place where families didn't lock their doors before 9 in the morning. On Sally Lane, in a colonial-style house in the 3900 block, 31-year-old Barbara Waldman was starting an ordinary Friday. Her husband, Gerald, a dentist, had already left for his practice. Her 3 children, Marla, Larry, and Eric, ages 7, 6, and 5, had gone to school. Barbara was home alone. Sometime that morning, a man came through the front or side door. There was no forced entry, nothing to suggest Barbara had fought to keep anyone out. She likely let him in, or found the door unlocked the way most neighbors did on any given weekday. What happened next took place upstairs, in her own bedroom, and by the time it was over, Barbara Waldman was dead on the floor. Mail was delivered. Cars pulled in and out of driveways up and down the block. Ordinary Friday routines carried on around a house that had, without anyone realizing it, become a crime scene. It was Eric who found her. He came home from kindergarten around midday, walked through the front door alone, and went upstairs looking for his mother. What he found there is the image he described decades later, the one that never left. Somewhere on that block, an unnamed neighbor had noticed something small just hours earlier, a man in a heavy coat, walking away on foot. She hadn't thought much of it at the time. By the time Eric's discovery reached the people who could do something about it, the man in that coat was already gone, and Nassau County was about to open an investigation with almost nothing to go on but a 5-year-old's discovery and a stranger nobody had thought twice about. Nassau County homicide detectives arrived to a house that told them almost nothing. The rooms hadn't been ransacked. Nothing of value was missing. Whatever had happened on Sally Lane that morning, it wasn't a robbery gone wrong. What detectives did have was physical. Inside the house, they lifted a fingerprint, clean and well-defined, that didn't belong to Barbara, her husband, or her children. And they had a witness. The neighbor who'd seen a man walking away gave investigators a description detailed enough to work with: a heavy coat, a fur-lined collar, a build, a direction of travel. From her account, police artists built a composite sketch. Both pieces of evidence went to work immediately. The sketch was distributed across Oceanside, then across Nassau County, posted in businesses, published in local papers, pinned to community bulletin boards. Detectives canvassed Sally Lane and the surrounding blocks door to door. The fingerprint went the other direction, into every offender database available to law enforcement in 1974, checked at the local, state, and federal level. It was a serious and thorough effort. And it produced nothing. Not because detectives missed something obvious, but because of a problem no one in that department could solve in 1974. Fingerprint comparison back then required a name to check against first. Investigators couldn't run a print against millions of anonymous citizens, only against people already flagged as suspects. And the man who left that print had never given anyone a reason to flag him. The sketch fared no better. It circulated for months without a single confirmed identification. Tips came in and were checked against the timeline, and each one led nowhere. By the time the initial investigation quieted, Nassau County detectives had 2 genuine pieces of evidence and 0 leads they could act on. Somewhere in Oceanside, the man who left that fingerprint was still walking the same streets he always had. With no stranger identified, investigators did what homicide detectives in 1974 were trained to do when a married woman is killed inside her own home: they looked at her husband. Gerald Waldman was brought in for questioning more than once. Detectives checked his account against the timeline and looked for any physical evidence connecting him to the scene. They found none. His alibi held under repeated scrutiny. Nassau County Police never charged him with any crime. But an investigation clearing a man and a community believing he's innocent turned out to be 2 different things. The absence of an arrest didn't erase the suspicion, it just left it with nowhere to go. Some of the same patients who sat in Gerald's dental chair each week did so while quietly wondering whether the man numbing their gums had killed his own wife. 6 months after Barbara's death, Gerald remarried, bringing a stepmother into the household. For some in the community, that timing alone deepened the doubt rather than settled it. Marla, only 7 when her mother died, grew up hearing the whispers directly, that people believed her father might have been responsible. She would later describe that suspicion as a mark of disgrace that weighed on the entire family for years. Gerald never publicly addressed the rumors. He worked, raised his children, built a second marriage, and over time became a respected figure in the same community that had doubted him. He carried that suspicion until his death in 2006, never learning who actually killed his wife and never hearing anyone publicly say his name was clean. The real killer, meanwhile, had never been questioned, and was still living inside the same small community that had spent 30 years looking at the wrong man. If a case like this is the reason you keep coming back to this channel, go ahead and hit subscribe now, because what this family went through to get an answer only gets harder to sit with from here. By the 1990s, forensic science had caught up with technology the original investigators never had: DNA testing. Biological evidence from the crime scene was still preserved, and analysts developed a male DNA profile from it, running it through CODIS, the FBI's national database that checks crime scene DNA against convicted offenders. The search came back empty. Whoever left that DNA had never been convicted of anything serious enough to require a sample. 2 decades in, investigators now had a fingerprint and a DNA profile, both collected from the same house on the same morning, and neither could produce a name. Then, at some point in the years that followed, the case appeared to break open. A man already serving time in prison confessed to killing Barbara Waldman. Investigators tested his DNA against the crime scene profile. It didn't match. The confession wasn't true. Investigators tried again later, comparing the Waldman DNA against a man already convicted of a strikingly similar killing in nearby Valley Stream back in 1968. That DNA didn't match either. 2 men, examined seriously, both ruled out by the same science that had failed to identify anyone in the first place. After 2 decades of testing, false confessions, and cross-case comparisons, Nassau County was no closer to a name than the day the fingerprint was first lifted. While the department's leads kept running out, one person never stopped working the case: Marla Waldman. She had been 7 when her mother was killed, old enough to remember Barbara clearly and old enough to carry the absence of an answer into her own adulthood. Starting not long after the murder and continuing for 4 decades, Marla made herself a constant presence in the investigation. She called the homicide squad repeatedly, asking what was being done, whether anyone was still looking. When calls went unanswered, she showed up at the precinct in person. On her own time, she tracked down court records, property records, and old newspaper archives, building a picture of the case that existed nowhere in any official file. She filled a whiteboard with names, dates, and notes pulled from years of conversations. She called people out of old high school yearbooks, cold, just to ask what they remembered. She later admitted she'd become consumed by it, that finding her mother's killer had turned into something close to an obsession. There were entire years when nobody at the department returned her calls, and long stretches when the case wasn't being actively worked by anyone but her. For most of that time, the forensic technology capable of finally identifying the killer didn't exist yet. She kept going anyway. What Marla didn't know was that the tool she'd been waiting decades for was about to become available, and her pressure on the department was part of the reason the case was still open to use it on. In 2024, 50 years after the murder, Nassau County partnered with Othram, a private forensic genetics laboratory based in Texas, and submitted the case's original biological evidence for advanced. And the medical examiner, Othram's scientists used forensic-grade genome sequencing to build a full DNA profile from decades-old samples earlier technology had never been able to process. That August, the case produced its first real movement in 50 years, a match. But a genetic hit alone wasn't enough to close a homicide case. As police would later explain, DNA alone doesn't automatically establish who committed a crime. Further investigation was still required. Marla learned of the breakthrough around this time, roughly a year and a half before the public would. The profile was handed to the FBI's forensic genetic genealogy team, who approached the case differently than CODIS ever could. CODIS only works if a suspect's own DNA is already in a criminal database, and this man's never had been. Instead, investigators uploaded the profile to consumer ancestry databases, the same services millions of people use to research their own family history, where distant relatives had voluntarily shared their DNA for entirely unrelated reasons. A partial match surfaced among those relatives. From that single thread, genealogists built outward, constructing a family tree branch by branch, cross-referencing each connection against public records, until it narrowed to a single family that had never left Oceanside. The man at the center of that tree had been living inside the same small community as the Waldmans the entire time. Investigators now had a family. What they needed next was one specific name inside it. Everything you've heard so far, the fingerprint, the sketch, the wrong suspicions, the false confessions, was building toward a single photograph. Stay with this next part, because that's exactly where the case turns. The name investigators finally connected to the case was Thomas Generasio. Born in February 1947, he had grown up in Oceanside and never left it. In 1974, he worked as a sanitation worker for the town of Hempstead, collecting trash along the same residential streets where the Waldman family lived. He had 2 prior arrests, one for assault, one for possession of stolen property, but neither required a DNA sample at the time. His name had never appeared anywhere in the original case file. Marla learned his identity before it became public, and she didn't wait for confirmation. She began digging into where Generasio had lived and worked, calling anyone who might remember him. Through her own outreach, she made contact with several of Generasio's own children, some of whom told her they had barely known their father themselves. One of his adult daughters agreed to help. Over several conversations, that daughter sent Marla old family photographs. One stopped Marla completely. Her father, wearing a coat with a thick, fur-lined collar, the same distinctive style described in the composite sketch drawn from a neighbor's memory 50 years earlier. A sketch built from a few seconds glance in 1974, and a family snapshot taken years apart. In what appeared to be the same coat on the same man. Generasio's daughter, for her part, wasn't convinced. She told reporters she didn't believe the photograph proved anything on its own, and that she couldn't imagine her father capable of killing anyone. By then, Generasio himself couldn't answer any of it. He had died of cancer in 2004, at 57, having spent his entire adult life just blocks from the family whose lives he'd altered. For years after the murder, his collection route ran directly through the Waldmans' neighborhood. He was never once questioned. Investigators now had DNA, a family tree, and a photograph all pointing at the same man, and Nassau County was finally ready to say his name in public. On March 11, 2026, Nassau County Police Commissioner Patrick Ryder stood at a podium alongside FBI agents and Barbara's 3 children and announced what investigators had spent a year and a half confirming. Thomas Generasio was responsible for Barbara Waldman's murder. Ryder was direct about what happened that morning, describing a violent sexual assault followed by a fatal gunshot as Barbara lay tied up on her bedroom floor. He said it wasn't DNA alone that closed the case, but the combined weight of the genetic match, the genealogy trail, witness interviews, and the photograph Marla had helped surface. There would be no trial. Generasio had been dead for more than 20 years, and no courtroom could weigh in on what the evidence now made clear. What the family received instead wasn't a legal verdict, it was public confirmation, delivered by the people who'd spent decades unable to give it. Marla, 59 years old at the podium, said what she'd waited her entire adult life to say, that her father was exonerated, that he'd been a victim of suspicion, not a villain deserving of it. She described the moment less as justice than as psychological resolution, an answer in place of a verdict that could never come. Her brother Larry, 6 when their mother died, spoke next. He talked about how the loss had shaped him, making him more attentive as a partner and a father. And then he said the line that carried the weight of everything before it, that the identification was also vindication for their father, who had gone to his own deathbed in 2006 never really knowing. Eric, the boy who had walked through that front door 52 years earlier and found his mother on the bedroom floor, stood beside his siblings as an adult, the image he'd described as never fading finally attached to a name. Not a trial. Not a sentence. Just an answer, arriving decades after the people who needed it most had almost stopped believing it would come. If this true crime documentary stayed with you, tell us in the comments which detail hit hardest, whether it was the coat in that photograph or the decades Gerald spent under suspicion for something he never did. We go beyond the surface, always.